Well, good morning. It is September already. We always say that, right? Nothing new. September's like that mini New Year, right? The kids are back at school. You've already come back from vacation. Our Jewish friends always celebrate the New Year in September, right? So this is kind of a mini New Year. And I figured, well, let me go back to the beginning of sorts. Let me tell some unity stories, some new thought stories with some different twists, maybe things you haven't heard before. That's one of the reasons I'm here today. It's also a shameless plug. If this is working, there it is. It's a shameless plug for my class coming up this week, Unity in Diversity. You can sign up online or see us after the service. But this really is a very interesting time that we're living in. And I don't know how many of us really know this, but two very famous Americans that you'd know by name said that a new thought-like spirituality would eventually become the predominant religious expression in our country. Not the predominant religion, the predominant religious expression. We're going to explore that, so keep that in mind. So let's take a pulse of where we are today, all right? Where we are in our country, what we're doing, and how does that tie into new thought? Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Well, he probably didn't say that. But here's the truth. The truth is that that does hold some truth to it. It holds water. That history goes through cycles. And that things that came up before come up in a different type of way or a different visage in this era that we happen to be in. But many great minds have said that. Thomas Jefferson said it. Great historians like Arnold Toynbee and Daniel Quinn said that history goes through cycles. And I have to tell you, the most eloquent voices in this realm today, and if this is not working, folks, there we go. Some of the most eloquent voices today were written over 25 years ago. It's called The Fourth Turning. William Strauss and Neil Howe. William Strauss has died since the book was originally published in 1997. Neil Howe has just released a new edition of that. And in this book, the authors claim that America goes through existential crises every 80 years. And that a generation comes along in the last 20 years of that 80-year cycle and needs to step up. Needs to step up, awaken, bring up their awareness, and create a turning in politics and culture. So, according to Strauss and Howe, we're going through a great gate in history right now. And you're probably saying, oh, Chris, come on, it's not that bad. Come on, it's not as bad. But wait a minute. They say that we went through the American Revolution, late 1700s. 80 years later, to the year, we started the Civil War. 80 years later, to the year, World War II started. And 80 years to the year, the Capitol riots took place. We're in that right now. And I know that that sounds pretty dire. And believe me, we're going to tie this into a new thought, and it ends much better. But the whole notion is that these dire times, the more dire the times are, the greater the reward can be. Crisis is always an opportunity. And history always teaches that. And this is nothing new. So, therefore, I think, let me see if I can get this going. Come on, there we go. Therefore, it's time. It's time for new thought. You know, new thought has always been part of the American story. It's always been part of the American soul. But it's kind of been the light shadow to much louder religious voices. Maybe now it's time for new thought to step up, to be the headliner, to be the main event. It's always been that side dish on the plate, you know, a little sprig of parsley. Now maybe it's time for new thought to express itself and to step up, as I said, as the main event on the main stage. Now, you know these folks, right? This is Richard Bunch just talked about these folks a little while ago. New thought came of age in the 1800s, and the Fillmores, of course, started Unity Church in the late 1800s. That is part of new thought. Now, I don't know if you know this gentleman. His name is Ernest Holmes. Has anyone ever heard of Ernest Holmes here? Good, maybe about a third of the audience. Ernest Holmes started religious science, also in the 19th century. Now, why do I bring that up? Because these two churches are the main pillars of what we call New Thought in the United States and actually around the world. Sure, there are other independent New Thought churches like Michael Beckwith's church out in California. Marianne Williamson had Renaissance Unity, believe it or not, in Michigan, but they've never been associated with any other churches. But unity and religious science have been those new pillars, or those pillars of main New Thought. And New Thought grew up in the 19th century. So you had a time where, look, the times in America were harsh, right? People were moving west. There was a lot of poverty. There was a lot of consternation. Christianity gave you some certitude, right? Believe in Jesus, check the box, and you're in, and everything is going to be good. But there came a new movement in the 19th century that said, the way you hold your mind, the thoughts that you hold in your head, is the way to happiness, to health, and well-being. And this was the beginning of New Thought. A guy named Phineas Quimby up in Maine had contracted tuberculosis, and he used mesmerism and his mind to create well-being. He got through tuberculosis at a time where most people ended up dying. And he ended up talking, and at that same time, other thoughts started coming out about the science of the mind. So Quimby said that Jesus was the man, but Christ was the science. But again, he discovered the role, or at least he was the first one to discuss the role that the mind plays in health, well-being, and happiness. It was a progressive, liberal spirituality, not politically. It was a progressive spirituality that was rising. And of course, they stood on the shoulders of great men and women, as we are doing today. And of course, some of you have probably heard me, and even before me, Paula McDeasy would talk about the transcendentalists. We've all heard of people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, a great writer, but beyond that, he was a great American spiritual figure. This was a man who was too liberal for Unitarianism, okay? If you can believe that. But he was asked to give a speech at Harvard because he had graduated from Harvard Divinity School. And he stepped up to talk to the graduating class, and he basically told the class, you're not just to love Jesus, you're to be like Jesus. In fact, more than that, you are Jesus the Christ in utero. You are the Christ in utero. And he stood up there and he said, go it alone, refuse the good models of those that are sacred in the minds of men. Dare to love God without mediator or veil. This was a new metaphysics of consciousness. So the Emersonian philosophy is that we evolve outside of time and space, beyond our bodies, from lifetime to lifetime, transcending our bodies, transcending lifetimes, transcending births and deaths, and evolving both within time and space. And basically he said to those people at Harvard that day, you are the Christ. Well, they didn't invite him back for 30 years. But curiously enough, 30 years later, when he was invited back, they realized the error of his way. They realized the error of their ways in their handling of Emerson because they gave him an honorary degree. So Emerson was ahead of the curve. And of course, this kind of thinking of the transcendentalists is really what enlivened New Thought. There wouldn't have been an Ernest Holmes. There wouldn't have been the Fillmores without transcendental thinking. And of course, unity took on all of those beautiful attributes of New Thought, such as the fact that, again, Jesus is one of us and we are to be like Jesus. Unity was not about fear. It was not about guilt. There was not much of a devil or hell to speak of, right? There were no commandments, but there were principles. This was completely new in the religious pantheon of that century. It truly was New Thought. Unity took a look at scriptures metaphysically. They didn't say the Bible was just the Word of God and all of this stuff is real. They looked at the Bible symbolically. Unity also engaged in ancient wisdom, and they welcomed in thoughts from the East. Oh, horrors. Even today, some Christian churches don't even want to know about any other kind of mystical legend or religion. And yet, unity and religious science allowed that in. And I would say even today, unity and New Thought was a harbinger of the kind of philosophy that we have seen with the quantum physicists of the 20th century. which looks at things such as the fact that consciousness is fundamental and that how we observe things, that's how things often show up. Now, New Thought influenced two men who have at one time been called the greatest preachers in the United States. And there he is, Norman Vincent Peale. Probably many of you have heard that name, even though he wrote his great book, The Power of Positive Thinking, in the 1950s. Sold millions of books, millions. He started his own church in New York. He was an inspiration to the nation. Even today, Guideposts has 2.5 million subscribers. The man was well known. I mean, the book was on the bestseller list for 185 weeks in a row. Lauded in America. Went to the main television shows and everything. But here's a story they probably never told you about Norman Vincent Peale. When he was a young reporter at a Detroit newspaper, as a young man, he was messing up a lot. He was mucking it up. He was very fearful. And one day his editor pulled him aside and he said, "You're thinking of self. Stop thinking of yourself. If you're thinking of yourself, you're going to be fearful. You need to stop thinking of yourself." Took a book, shoved it in his hand to read. It was a book by Ernest Holmes. And Norman Vincent Peale took all this in, and his ministry began. In fact, Norman Vincent Peale met Ernest Holmes, the man who founded religious science, which today, of course, is the Center for Spiritual Living. And they met on a movie set called One Foot in Heaven. And Peale absolutely loved Ernest Holmes. However, when he'd go out on the circuit, all of inspiration came from the Bible. Jesus was the only teacher. Never mentioned Ernest Holmes in his biography, in his speeches, and nowhere online, if you looked at Norman Vincent Peale's church, Marble Collegiate, is there any mention of Ernest Holmes. It was only prior to his death that Ernest Holmes gave tribute to the man who really inspired him. That was the man of New Thought, Ernest Holmes. Now, who's the greatest preacher or the biggest preacher in America today? Let me hear some names. Come on. Did I hear Joel Osteen? There you go. There's Joel. He just shows up, right? So on a Sunday morning, and I listened to him a little bit today, and probably some of you here at Unity will listen to Joel Osteen. He'll give about a 50-minute talk on New Thought, and towards the end he'll say, "Now make sure you go to a good Bible-believing church." And I'm thinking, Joel, if I go to just a Bible-believing church, I'm probably not going to hear the last 50 minutes of New Thought that you just dispensed to me. But here's one of those things that many of us don't know, is that Joel Osteen's dad, John Osteen, started Lakewood Ministries there in Houston out of a little feed store in Houston, built it up, built it up, built it up. But his messages every week were New Thought messages, how the mind creates reality, how it creates happiness, how it can bring you back to health. And Joel Osteen and John Osteen, whoops, going ahead. Here, let me come back here. Let's not go too far. There we go. It's got a mind of its own today. All right. Joel Osteen, John Osteen, his dad, and Joel read the Fillmores, took the Fillmores in. What I mean by that, when he took all that information in. And not only that, Joel's greatest influence is this man, Howard Caesar. Has anyone here ever heard of Howard Caesar? Yeah, about 4 or 5 of you. All of you have heard of Joel Osteen. No one's heard of Howard Caesar. Howard Caesar was the Unity minister in Houston when John Osteen was there, and John Osteen would listen to his messages. And then when John died and Joel stepped into his position, Joel would listen to Howard Caesar's message. And as Richard Bunch illumined me to the fact that often Howard would talk about it, and 3 weeks later, Joel was talking about the same thing. So in some ways, the genius, if you will, of both Norman Vincent Peale and Joel Osteen is that they took New Thought and they JC'd it up. And in some ways, you've got to admire that, because what they did is they took something that was still a little too radical for mainstream religionists, and they gave them something that they could understand. Now, again, you never heard Peale speak about New Thought. You certainly are not going to, if you ask Joel Osteen about New Thought, he's probably going to tell you, it's Jesus and it's the Bible. But see, That's the story behind the story. And that may be indicative of the convergence that we're at today. You know, this book that I've just written and what the class is about is the convergence of these major belief systems: mysticism, atheism, religion, and science. As I look at people such as Joel Osteen and Norman Vincent Peale, they have co-opted New Thought. That's great. Even Howard Caesar says very laudable things about Joel Osteen. But is it time for New Thought itself to step to the front of the stage? Is this the age where we see this? Now, I said earlier on, there are two great Americans who said that a New Thought-like spirituality would eventually become the predominant religious expression here in the nation. One was Thomas Jefferson. I know, that was well before New Thought, I get it. But just listen to this. Jefferson was a deist, and he had some Freemasonry affectations and influences in his life. And he loved Unitarianism. Now again, Unitarianism is not considered part of unity, and it's not part of New Thought, but there wouldn't be a unity or a religious science without Unitarianism, because they broke away from the fundamentalism of Anglicanism and Calvinism and all the very orthodox Christianities of the time. They didn't spend much time on hell. They didn't talk about sin that much. And that's why 5 of our first 6 founding fathers, presidents, were Unitarians. And Jefferson, of course, was influenced by that. In fact, he said about 3 years prior to his death, "I hope there is not a young man," I'm sorry, I'll say that again. "I hope there's not a young American now living who will not die a Unitarian." So even several hundred years ago, they were looking at a spiritual bent that was off the mainstream. And so did this gentleman as well, about 100 years later. Anyone recognize that face? His name is William James. Some people have called him the greatest mind in America. He is the father of American psychology. He wrote the tome, The Varieties of Religious Experience. He ended up being the first head of Harvard psychiatry department. He is the one who coined the term New Thought. He called it the religion of healthy mindedness. That's where the whole term comes from. And James made sure that people understood that New Thought could indeed change their lives. In fact, more than that, he said that New Thought was the only distinctive religious concept that America gave to the world. The predominant religious expression in the nation is what he said New Thought would eventually become. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm still waiting. But I kind of think that the Jeffersons and the James have it right, that we have been on this track, and we're moving towards this track. Oh, and for good measure, William James was not only the father of American psychology, he was also the founder of the American Society for Psychical Research. Yeah. A venerated mind, a great American, a great mind, was also open to psychic phenomena. So, what time is it? Oh, it's time for a pop quiz. That's right. We've got to have a pop quiz. So, sometimes when I give a pop quiz, you know, it's got a true and false aspect to it, or it's multiple choice. This is a little different, so I'm going to give wide latitude on the answer here, too. And there might be a gift. I don't know. Probably not a trip to Orlando, but maybe a book, okay? So let me throw this at you and see what anyone comes up with. Here's the question. What do Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Thomas Jefferson, and Bill Maher all have in common religiously? Religiously. That's a good question. That's partial credit there. Any others?
They're critics.
The question, I won't repeat the answer, but I will repeat the question. Unless this is Jeopardy, then I'd be in the form of a question, right? What do Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Thomas Jefferson, and Bill Maher all have in common religiously? Go ahead, ma'am. They believe in love. That's going to probably be as close as we're going to get to the answer today. They all saw that Jesus was the greatest moral and ethical teacher the world has ever known. You have a Hindu, you have a black Christian, you have a deist, and you have an atheist. Jesus is just all right. Joel Osteen could agree with that, and Ernest Holmes and the Fillmores. And see, here's the big difference, though, between New Thought and traditional Christianity. In New Thought, Jesus is not the great exception. He's the great example. And for us to really grok the notion that we are eternal beings, maybe many lifetimes, maybe other experiences, and that, my goodness, we're on the same track, the same hero's journey as Jesus is. And again, that's what they tossed Emerson out of Harvard for. How dare you say that? But that's not what New Thought says. New Thought says that Jesus is not the great exception. He's the great example. Jesus is what all men and women can become, what all men and women must become, no matter how many years, lifetimes, experiences. We are all Christ's in the making. And maybe that's the big difference between spirituality and religion. I'll borrow a phrase from Swami Beyondananda, okay? Spirituality is accessing the divine. Religion is crowd control. So we're here at a church that doesn't believe in crowd control. So let's take a quick look. Oh, this really does have a mind of its own today. Come on back. There we go. There we go. So where are we today? Look, I'm not going to soft soap this. A year from now, we've got an election coming up, right? And we talk about being polarized in this nation. And if you really want to know what polarization looks like, it looks like about half the people in the country want to get a certain candidate reelected, and the other half wants to put him in jail. That is a sobering moment. That is the aspect of polarization. And this is what Neil Howe and William Strauss said back in 1997. Before the year 2025, America will pass through a great gate of history where the very survival of the nation will feel at stake. The nation could erupt into insurrection or civil violence, democracy could be destroyed, and millions of people scattered or killed. Or America could enter a new golden age. The rhythms of history do not reveal the outcome of the coming crisis. All they suggest is the timing and dimension. I'm not a pessimist, I'm not an optimist, I'm a realist. I know one thing is for certain. I've been called to be here at this time. You've been called here to be at this time. Your soul is in this place at this time. And it's time for new thought. It's time for new thought to stand on the stage. It's time to share and celebrate the great messages of New Thought. It's time to honor the mystical paths of all religion, which New Thought does. It's time to honor science, but also to challenge scientific materialism, which New Thought does. And it's time to not believe that atheists are going to hell, which New Thought also believes. This is a time of the convergence of major belief systems unlike the world has ever known. We've chosen to be here. And as Pierre Chardin said, everything that rises must converge. The spirit of America that has been shaped by New Thought must now guide America at this time in our lives. So today is Labor Day, or almost Labor Day. It's a mini new year of sorts. Let's jump into this new year with life and love in our hearts, confident of who we are, confident of where we've come from, and confident of how we're going to show up. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and go into meditation. And we are just all grateful to be here today. So I'd like to ask you to focus in on your heart. Maybe place your hand on your heart if you'd like. And let's breathe through our heart chakra, through the fountain, the font of wisdom of who we are, the very center of our being. And as you breathe through your heart, bring to mind a certain regenerative feeling of love. Maybe someone you love, maybe a pet, maybe for your love of your country, maybe for your love of unity, New Thought in this church. And hold that in your heart. And feel that here. And let that light grow. And now let it course through your entire being. Know that all is well. That we are called to be here at this time, to be our best selves. To be courageous, to be loving, to be knowing in our destiny. Let's take a moment in silence in our hearts at this moment. And as we lift ourselves up and come back into this room, we recognize our own divinity, the divinity of one another, how intimately we are connected with one another, how we support one another, how we love each other, how we show up, comes from this font of wisdom and love. And so it is.
Speak.